Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Trevor returned to his remote Napa estate, he expected silence. Instead, he found chaos, his prized garden demolished, his land stolen, and a polished plaque claiming it all. But this wasn't vandalism, it was war, and someone just declared it without knowing who they were dealing with. When I pulled into my driveway that late afternoon, I expected the familiar quiet of my land, the kind of silence you only get in the hills of Napa, where even the wind seems to respect property lines. Instead, I stepped out of my truck into a scene that looked like a landscaping company and a demolition crew had gotten drunk together and decided to collaborate. The first thing that hit me was the smell of freshly overturned soil mixed with something almost metallic, like snapped branches and shredded bark. My botanical garden, my pride, my work of decades, my living archive of rare cultivars was unrecognizable. The soil was raked into unnatural patterns, the ground cratered where healthy beds had once been, and someone had installed decorative stone paths in places I had never even considered walking. They didn't match the terrain, the irrigation, or even basic human logic. And then I saw the plaque. A giant metal sign, polished so aggressively it reflected the setting sun like a lighthouse, stood hammered into the center of what used to be my experimental grove of subtropical perennials. The inscription read, "Project of Civic Partnership, the Eco Alley of Marissa Bennington." I stood still for a few seconds because my brain refused to load the idea that someone had not only trespassed, but claimed authorship, with branding, right in the middle of my garden. My jaw clenched when I saw the biggest wound of all. 3 of my rare Korean dogwoods, the ones I had nursed from saplings and protected through every California heatwave, lay hacked down in pieces like firewood rejects. Their stumps bled pale sap into the dirt. Someone had dragged their trunks aside, letting them dry out in the sun like trash. The humorless part of my brain kicked in first. I pulled out my phone and started recording everything. I moved slowly, narrating the destruction like a crime scene investigator. Broken irrigation lines, wheel ruts carved deep enough to fill with runoff, root systems torn from the ground, the jagged base of every tree. My voice stayed even, but I could hear the exhaustion under it. I zoomed in on the shattered gate latch. Apparently someone had simply taken a grinder to it. Classy. I circled around to the far end of the property, where I found piles of uprooted plants, most of them smashed or sunburned beyond saving. They had even replanted cheap decorative shrubs I wouldn't use to decorate a gas station. I called Dr. Harris, my independent agronomy consultant, and he came within an hour. He walked the grounds with the grim expression of a surgeon delivering unwelcome news. While he took samples of soil that had clearly been compacted by machinery, I kept noticing new pockets of destruction. Plants I had been crossbreeding for half a decade had been pulled out like weeds. Custom irrigation nodes I had built by hand were snapped apart, probably by careless boots. Harris finally gave a low whistle and said, "Trevor, this is going to be expensive." His initial verbal estimate, $23,000 of direct damage, not even counting the genetic losses, landed like a stone in my chest, but I only nodded and told him to prepare a full written assessment. If someone wanted to ruin my land, then I wanted every penny documented. When he left, the sun was nearly gone, and the shadows across my ruined garden made the place look like a battlefield. I went inside, pulled out the original land documents from 1898, and compared them to the modern parcel map. Every line confirmed what I already knew. This land was private, never part of any municipal project, never within any HOA, never ceded to anyone. My family had kept the borders clean for generations. Whoever had done this hadn't just trespassed, they had ignored more than a century of property records. Knowing my neighbor to the west, the honorable, indispensable, thoroughly self-appointed queen of local beautification, Marissa Bennington, it wasn't hard to guess who had birthed this disaster. I drafted a formal notice of damages, wrote out the full sum of $23,000, attached the preliminary agronomy report, and sent the entire packet to Marissa's email, her office mailbox at the so-called Landscape Improvement Union, and her residence. I included a deadline that would make any decent attorney salivate. Then I reported the intrusion to the county office, attaching photos of the broken gate mechanism and the visible tracks of a commercial landscaping crew. Before going to bed, I pulled up the footage from my motion-activated cameras. Seeing the recordings made my stomach twist. Marissa herself stood at my gate in broad daylight, pointing her perfectly manicured finger at the lock while one of her workers cut through it. She walked the property like a woman conducting a symphony only she could hear, waving her arms, directing crew members where to dig and where to plant her tasteless benches. At one point, she actually posed for a photo in front of my dogwoods before they were cut down. I watched the glowing timestamp on the footage. The violation hadn't happened days ago. It had happened just 2 mornings earlier while I was presenting research in Seattle. I saved all the footage, backed it up twice, then sat at my kitchen table staring at the dark garden beyond the window. There was no anger left, just a sharp, focused clarity. Someone had crossed a line carved into my family's soil for over a century, and I intended to make sure they paid for every inch they took. The next morning, I had barely finished my coffee when I saw a familiar champagne-colored Lexus winding up my driveway like it owned the place. I set my mug down, stepped outside, and watched Marissa Bennington unfold herself from the driver's seat with the practiced elegance of someone who'd been applauded for simply existing her entire adult life. She wore oversized sunglasses, a cream blazer, and the expression of a woman who expected gratitude for burning your house down. Her heels sank slightly into the softened earth where her crew had torn through my irrigation system, but she didn't seem to notice. "Trevor," she called, smiling like a politician posing for a brochure. "We need to clear up this little misunderstanding." There was no mistaking the tone. She wasn't here to apologize. She was here to dominate. I crossed my arms and waited. Marissa marched toward me, waving a stack of papers. "I received your letter," she said, hitting the word like it tasted sour. $23,000. Really? For weeds and invasive trash shrubs? She glanced around as though expecting applause from the non-existent audience. "I did you a favor. Your property was becoming an embarrassment to the community." I actually laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You trespassed, destroyed rare specimens, and vandalized private land. My garden is not community property." She scoffed, flipping her hair in a gesture that had probably once charmed judges' panels and charity boards. "Your land was part of a community improvement initiative. I filed it formally. It was approved. And frankly, Trevor, your yard was a hazard. I've had multiple complaints about the appearance of this place." "From whom?" I asked. She hesitated a beat too long. I let the silence stretch until she sniffed and continued. "That's irrelevant. What matters is that I acted in the best interests of everyone, including you." I could feel something cold settle in my chest. Not fear, but the deep irritation of a person listening to someone confidently recite fiction. "Your workers cut through my locked gate. That's felony trespass." "That gate was obstructing public access to a beautification corridor," she snapped. "You're lucky I didn't cite you." Then she brightened, as if remembering to play benevolent queen. "But I'm willing to let all that go if you drop this ridiculous invoice." I didn't respond. I just stared at her until her smile faltered, then collapsed entirely. She pointed a finger inches from my chest. "You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you? I serve on the County Development Advisory Board. I oversee these projects. I decide what's best for this area. And you," she jabbed her finger at the ruined garden behind me, "have been ignoring guidelines for years." I stepped back deliberately, so she had to lower her hand. "My land predates your advisory board by about 120 years. There are no guidelines here except state law, which you violated." Something in her eyes tightened, a microscopic flicker of panic that she smothered almost immediately. "Then you'll be hearing from the city," she said, turning sharply and snapping her fingers at no one in particular. "Enjoy the consequences of your stubbornness." She got in her car and peeled out of the driveway, leaving ruts where my ferns once grew. 2 hours later, the consequences arrived. A formal notice from the City Environmental Office landed in my inbox, copied to the County Development Board. According to the letter, Marissa had filed 3 separate complaints accusing me of cultivating potentially dangerous and invasive flora, violating undefined aesthetic compliance standards, and, my personal favorite, harassing licensed contractors performing approved public service work. Every claim was laughably false, but they were also documented in the sterile language of bureaucracy, just official enough to be dangerous if left unchallenged. I drove straight to the city offices and requested all public records associated with the so-called improvement project. The receptionist gave me a pained smile when I asked for the documentation. "You're not the first person to come asking about her," she murmured quietly while pulling files. "But don't quote me on that." She slid a manila folder across the counter. Inside were copies of the project request forms Marissa had filed. One note stood out like a flare. Land parcel west of County Road 7 designated as underutilized, recommended for eco-public enhancement. Underutilized, meaning mine. My jaw clenched as I flipped pages. She had listed my land as a municipal strip. The application referenced a boundary map I had never seen before. The parcel ID was correct, but it was labeled as belonging to the county. Someone had literally altered ownership on an official document. A thin, anxious-looking planning clerk approached me as I skimmed the papers. He leaned in slightly and whispered, "If you're planning to fight her, document everything. She pushes things through. People don't like crossing her." He glanced around nervously. "She has friends on the council." I thanked him and left before anyone else could warn me about how untouchable she thought she was. At home, I scanned every document, timestamped them, and organized them with the photos and videos. The more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't some overzealous neighbor pruning branches. This was a calculated maneuver disguised behind philanthropy and titles. The sun dipped low again by the time I finished cataloging everything. I sat on my porch, staring toward the west where Marissa's mansion caught the last golden light like a smug, oversized lantern. I didn't need to guess what she was planning next. People like her always escalated when challenged. She had opened with trespass, then countered with false complaints. The next move would come soon enough. And when it did, I intended to be ready. By the time the third morning rolled around, I felt like I had aged a decade. Not from fear or uncertainty, but from the sheer absurdity of having to defend land that had belonged to my family longer than electricity had belonged to half the country. I brewed a pot of strong coffee, sat down with the manila folder from the planning office, and began combing through every document with the precision of a forensic accountant. If Marissa thought her little paperwork games would confuse me, she had severely underestimated how many hours of my life I had spent grading student research papers filled with fabricated citations. The first few pages of her project application were predictable, flowery descriptions of civic enhancement, public beautification, and ecological synergy that read like they'd been copied from a grant-writing guide for bored retirees. But then I reached the map that absolutely should not have existed. According to the neatly labeled boundaries, my entire western stretch, nearly a quarter-acre of soil enriched by 5 generations of Deltons, was marked as County Beautification Zone. Every property line from the official GIS database had been duplicated accurately, except for mine. In Marissa's version, the border dipped inward, slicing off a chunk of my land and wrapping it in a neutral gray shading reserved for unclaimed or municipal areas. It was like some kind of territorial amputation performed without anesthesia. I stared at the altered lines for a long moment, tracing them with my thumb. They weren't clumsy edits. Someone had taken the time to reproduce the thickness of the official border strokes, adjust the labels, and align the coordinates so the fraud wouldn't be obvious at a glance. This wasn't a mistake. It was a digital forgery. I compared it to the real county parcel map on my laptop. My legitimate boundary extended exactly where it always had, confirmed by survey markers from the 1920s, updated in the 70s, and reaffirmed in a digital update 3 years ago. Marissa's version cut straight through that history like a hot knife through butter. She hadn't just stolen plants, she had attempted a bureaucratic land theft under the pretense of beautification. As I kept reading, my stomach tightened. The grant approval letter was attached next. It congratulated the project lead on securing $15,000 from the Municipal Green Corridor Fund. The description claimed the project would improve visual cohesion and ecological safety along the travel corridor adjacent to County Road 7. The kicker, the site listed for the enhancement was my land. She had framed my garden as neglected, underutilized, and visually inconsistent with the surrounding district identity. I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. My garden had been featured in 2 academic publications and 1 regional horticulture magazine, but apparently none of that beat Marissa's personal aesthetic. I continued turning pages until I found the document that made everything click into place. Her grant budget. Of the $15,000 awarded, over $9,000 had been allocated for labor, $4,000 for design, and the rest for materials. The landscaping crew that had bulldozed my rare specimens had likely been paid with taxpayer money, and judging by the quality of their work, most of that labor cost had probably evaporated into someone's pocket. The numbers screamed of padding, a trick as old as public funding itself. I grabbed my keys and drove to UC Davis to meet with Professor Harlow from the Landscape Architecture Department. She'd been my mentor during graduate school, the kind of woman who could spot a forged document faster than most people could spot a typo. When I arrived, she examined the map under her magnifying lamp with a raised eyebrow that told me everything I needed to know. "Someone altered this deliberately," she said. "This isn't sloppiness. This is calculated redrawing. And whoever did it knew exactly how to make it look official." She tapped the corner of the page lightly. "If this made it through the approval process, there's a good chance she's done something like this before." I exhaled slowly. "I was afraid you'd say that." Harlow folded her arms. "Trevor, you need to file a complaint with the Grant Oversight Office. This is grant fraud, plain and simple. And if she used falsified maps, that's not just unethical, it's criminal." I left her office feeling strangely calm, the kind of calm that arrives when anger becomes focus. On the drive home, I called the Municipal Grants Review Board, requested formal oversight intervention, and submitted digital copies of every document I had collected. They promised to look into the matter, which in bureaucratic terms usually meant either swift action or a slow-motion explosion. I wasn't sure which outcome I preferred. When I got home, I noticed something that made my hands tighten around the steering wheel. A black SUV sat parked just beyond my fence line, tinted windows facing directly toward my house. Cameras had caught it earlier, but now I could see it in person. Someone inside was taking photos. No attempt to hide it. I pulled out my phone, zoomed in, and captured every detail of the license plate. The moment the SUV saw me recording, it drove off slowly, almost tauntingly, as if to say, "We're watching." It didn't take a genius to guess who had sent them. If Marissa had been bold enough to carve up a map, a little surveillance was nothing. Inside, I uploaded the photo of the SUV into my evidence folder. Next to it, I placed the altered map and the grant budget. On paper, the story was beginning to look less like neighborly interference and more like a long-running self-funded empire of civic theater. Before the sun set, I sent one more message, to my future self, really. I typed out everything I had discovered and stored it in my digital journal, because if I had learned anything from my years teaching agronomy, it was that documentation wins wars, whether they're fought in soil or in courtrooms. And judging by the day's discoveries, I was going to need every scrap of it. By the next morning, I had made up my mind. There was no point waiting for Marissa to come to her senses, because people like her didn't come to anything. They bulldozed, they threatened, and when cornered, they tried to rewrite reality itself. I opened my laptop, pulled up the folder labeled Evidence Bennington, and stared at the growing archive. Videos of her trespass, photos of the destroyed garden, the doctored map, the grant documents, even the shot of her surveillance SUV lurking. Like a budget spy thriller. I didn't feel intimidated. I felt organized. And that was a far deadlier feeling. I called attorney Liza Garcia, a land use specialist I had worked with years before on a soil rights project. Liza was the kind of lawyer who smiled politely while sharpening a legal knife behind her back. She answered on the second ring, listened for maybe 2 minutes, then said, "Trevor, bring everything. If she forged public documents, we're not dealing with a neighbor dispute. We're dealing with fraud, trespass, and possibly embezzlement." I arrived at her office with my digital folder and a portable hard drive. Liza combed through the files with the kind of precision that made me grateful she was on my side. Every time she found something damning, she muttered a low, "That's interesting," which, translated from lawyer language, meant, "I'm going to dismantle this woman atom by atom." When we finally had everything laid out, she leaned back in her chair and steepled her fingers. "Here's what we're filing: civil trespass, destruction of private property, defamation, malicious interference, misuse of municipal funds, and fraudulent alteration of county records. And we're requesting a full audit of all grants she handled in the past 5 years. If she's done this once, she's done it before." I felt a pulse of satisfaction. Good. Liza gave a thin smile. "Trevor, people like her rely on intimidation and connections, but they crumble under evidence. You have mountains of it." She paused, scanning another document. "She's going to come after you hard once she's served the papers. Just stay steady." I didn't have to wait long. The lawsuit was filed at noon. By 5 in the evening, Marissa was storming up my driveway for the second time that week. This time, she didn't bother with sunglasses or charm. Her face was flushed, twisted with outrage, like someone had told her she'd been demoted from royalty to taxpayer. She didn't even close her car door. "How dare you? How dare you drag my name into court like I'm some criminal? You forged a map and cut down my trees," I said calmly. "This is the natural consequence." She pointed a shaking finger at me, her voice rising so sharply it startled a flock of birds from the oak tree above. "You think you can intimidate me with paperwork? I know everyone on the council. I know every contractor in this county. You are making a grave mistake." "Funny," I said. "I was thinking the same thing about you." Her jaw quivered. "I offered you a peaceful solution. You offered me joint custody of my own land." She stomped closer, heels sinking into the dirt. "If you push this, I will make your life miserable. I'll have the city condemn this entire property. I will have inspectors here every morning. I will—" She froze mid-sentence when she noticed the red light blinking from my porch camera. Her eyes darted toward it, widening as if she'd only just realized her threats weren't happening in a vacuum. I didn't say anything. I just let the silence stretch. Slowly, she lowered her hand, composed herself, and turned away like a malfunctioning robot trying to reboot dignity. "You'll regret this," she hissed and marched back to her Lexus. That night, as if to prove her point, someone attempted to cut part of my newly repaired fence along the northern boundary. They didn't get far. My motion sensor floodlights activated, cameras kicked on, and the would-be saboteur fled before finishing the job. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify him, but the truck he ran to? Definitely the same landscaping company Marissa had hired. I filed a second police report, attached the video, and notified Liza. She responded within minutes. Good. Keep stacking evidence. She's unraveling. I sat on my porch afterward, watching the quiet dark settle over the hills. The night air smelled of soil and eucalyptus, familiar and grounding. But beneath it, I could feel the tension tightening, like the moment before a storm breaks. Marissa wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was panicking. And panicking people make mistakes. 2 days after the fence incident, I woke up to the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. For one irrational moment, I wondered if Marissa had decided to scale up from cutting fences to driving a bulldozer straight through my living room. But when I stepped outside, I saw a familiar gray sedan, Dr. Leonard Klein, the independent horticultural damage expert my insurance company insisted on using for large claims. Klein was punctual, methodical, and about as emotionally expressive as a wall calendar, exactly the kind of man whose evaluation judges loved. He stepped out holding his leather case with the care of a surgeon carrying an organ transplant. "Morning, Trevor," he said, adjusting his glasses. "I'm here for the secondary assessment." "Good. You'll want to see the south beds first. They took the worst of it." He followed me, taking notes in short, precise lines. At first, everything was normal, me explaining what each section used to contain, him kneeling to examine root damage, occasionally releasing a quiet sigh that translated roughly to, "This is a botanical war crime." But after about 20 minutes, I noticed something off. He seemed distracted, not in a casual way, more like a man trying to finish a test with someone whispering answers he knew were incorrect. When we reached the area where the dogwoods had been cut, he froze. Not in professional disapproval. This was a different kind of hesitation. He massaged his jaw, stared at the stump, then put his notebook away entirely. "Klein?" I asked. "Something wrong?" He cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes. "Did anyone reach out to you regarding this evaluation?" "No." "Why?" He exhaled slowly, like a man accepting his fate. "Marissa contacted me last night. She offered to clarify the nature of the damage and suggested that it would be best for everyone involved if I noted minimal losses. She also implied she had connections who could redirect future consulting referrals my way." I blinked once, then again. "She tried to bribe you." Klein adjusted his glasses again. It was phrased as a mutually beneficial understanding, but yes. I felt a sharp, bitter laugh rise. "And what did you tell her?" "That I am a licensed specialist," he said firmly, "not a political puppet." For the first time since I'd met him, I saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. Quiet, restrained, but unmistakable. I respected the hell out of him for it. "Please," he said, "include this information in your case. I will provide a signed statement." Before I could thank him, the sound of approaching engines echoed from the main road. Not one, three. A moment later, 2 police SUVs rolled into view, followed by a third unmarked cruiser. Klein stepped back, startled. I frowned. I hadn't called them. The officers approached with careful steps, hands resting near their holsters. One of them, a square-jawed man with a clipboard, spoke first. "Sir, we received an anonymous report alleging that you threatened a neighbor with a firearm." I stared at him. "With what gun?" "That's what we're here to determine." I didn't argue. Instead, I pointed at the camera mounted over the porch. "Everything from last night is recorded. If I had threatened anyone, you'd have it in high definition." They followed me inside while Klein remained outside at a respectful distance. I pulled up the footage, scrolling to the time frame they mentioned. The only thing the camera captured during that hour was a raccoon committing a federal-level assault on my compost bin. The lead officer watched the screen, then shook his head. "This doesn't match the report. At all." "Let me guess," I said. "Anonymous tip?" He hesitated, then nodded. Caller refused to identify themselves. We exchanged a look. Neither of us needed to say her name. Before the officers left, I gave them a copy of the footage showing the fence tampering and the landscaping crew trespassing. The lead officer's eyebrows rose slightly. "We'll attach this to the ongoing file. Things are starting to connect." Things were starting to connect? Fantastic. Maybe by winter, the county would figure out water was wet. After they left, Klein finished his assessment, now even more determined. By sunset, he handed me a signed preliminary statement confirming extensive damage, irreplaceable plant loss, and soil disruption requiring long-term remediation. But the day wasn't done. That evening, the town hall held its monthly public meeting, the kind where residents complained about potholes, teenagers loitering, and the eternal debate over whether leaf blowers constituted noise pollution or community torture. I went because my case had already leaked into the agenda. Marissa was there. She sat in the front row, posture rigid, pearls gleaming like tiny smug spotlights. And the moment the floor opened for comments, she exploded. She launched into a theatrical monologue about how I had threatened civic progress, how my garden was a known ecological hazard, and how I had behaved aggressively toward honest contractors. She even teared up at one point, which would have been convincing if the entire room wasn't watching her meltdown through a dozen raised phone cameras. I stood only after she finished, kept my voice calm, and laid out the facts. Trespass, destruction, forged documents, bribery attempts, false reports. The room shifted. People who had nodded sympathetically at her now stared like they were meeting the real Marissa for the first time. And somewhere in the back, a journalist recorded the entire exchange. As I left the building, I realized something important. She wasn't just losing control, she had already lost the narrative. The morning after the town hall fiasco, I woke to an unexpected email from the Municipal Grants Review Board. The subject line alone made my pulse jump. Preliminary findings, immediate site visit requested. If a government office moved faster than continental drift, it usually meant someone had screwed up spectacularly. I replied that I was available all day, then walked outside to check the property, half expecting to find Marissa camped out on my lawn with a megaphone. Instead, I found 2 unfamiliar vehicles parked just outside my gate, a white hybrid sedan and a gray county-issued SUV. 3 people stood by the fence, 2 wearing ID lanyards, one holding a bulky inspection clipboard like a shield against human stupidity. They introduced themselves briskly, auditors from the Grants Review Board and the County Compliance Division. Their voices carried the tired edge of people who spent their careers sifting through nonsense, but knew they had just stumbled upon something special. "We received your documents," the lead auditor said. The altered parcel map was concerning. Concerning was government speak for someone is about to lose their funding, reputation, and possibly their freedom. I led them across the property. They photographed everything: soil compression, ripped irrigation lines, exposed roots, saw marks on the dogwood stumps. One of them crouched beside the plaque, declaring the area the Eco Alley of Marissa Bennington, and let out a dry, humorless laugh. "This is public-funded branding," he murmured, "on private land." They asked to see the comparison I'd made between the real parcel map and the doctored one. I handed them the printouts. The youngest auditor squinted, then called the others over with a low whistle. "The coordinate grid is shifted manually," she said. "This wasn't an error. Someone altered the GIS layers intentionally. And look, see the compression artifacts near the boundary lines? This is a digital manipulation. Very clumsy, too. Whoever did this doesn't understand file forensics. I smiled thinly. She probably thought nobody would look closely. They exchanged glances, the kind that said, "This is bigger than we thought." The older auditor cleared his throat. "Mr. Delton, this is not the first complaint we've received about irregularities in projects she's overseen." Well, there it was. A quiet admission that my nightmare neighbor might have a longer resume of creative grant usage than anyone had dared confront. They asked permission to review my security footage, and I led them inside. As they watched Marissa directing contractors like a deranged symphony conductor, one of them shook his head slowly. "She used a municipal grant to pay for this," he said. "I can already see at least 4 violations: misappropriation, scope deviation, unapproved site alteration, and falsified boundary mapping. And that's if we're being generous," the younger one added. When they finished, the lead inspector exhaled sharply. "We'll be opening a formal inquiry, full audit, all her projects for at least the past 5 fiscal years. Do you need anything else from me?" I asked. "Everything you have," he replied. "And backup copies, preferably on a drive she can't accidentally misplace." I handed them 2 encrypted copies, and they thanked me before heading off toward their vehicles. As they left, I noticed a familiar black SUV idling at the far end of the road, angled just enough that someone inside could observe my property. Of course, Marissa's paranoia had been working overtime ever since the lawsuit. She wanted to know what the auditors found. She wanted to see whether I looked triumphant or panicked. So I smiled, waved directly at the SUV, and watched it peel away. Inside, my phone buzzed, an email from my attorney, forwarding a message from a county clerk. Someone on the Development Advisory Board, likely one of Marissa's allies, had tried to informally request details of my complaint and audit status. The board refused. They weren't idiots. When a federal adjacent grant audit starts, everyone's suddenly very afraid of touching anything. The same afternoon, my neighbor on the eastern side, an older winemaker named Carl, dropped by with a bottle of his Reserve Red and the expression of someone delivering both sympathy and gossip. "You might want to know," he said, leaning in. "Marissa has been making frantic calls to half the county offices today. Word is she's trying to push a narrative that you falsified the map to frame her." I snorted. "Good luck selling that." "She's desperate," Carl continued. "People are spooked. By tonight, the whole advisory council will know an audit's coming." As he left, I took a long breath. The chessboard had shifted. For weeks, Marissa had been acting like she was untouchable, the queen of courthouse connections and civic projects. But now, she was cornered, outmaneuvered not by power, but by her own paper trail. And cornered enemies always make their biggest mistakes next. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse buzzed like someone had whispered the word "scandal" into the ventilation system. I walked in with my attorney Liza, carrying nothing but a hard drive and the calm certainty that evidence was heavier than influence. Marissa arrived moments later, wrapped in white like she was auditioning for sainthood, flanked by a lawyer who looked like he charged extra for dramatic size. Inside the courtroom, the judge barely finished introductions before Liza launched into our case. She presented the map alterations first. The judge leaned forward, squinting at the forged boundaries. "This line is manually shifted," he said. "Who submitted this?" Liza answered by simply turning toward Marissa. Next came the footage. Marissa directing workers through my broken gate, ordering cuts, pointing at beds like a general marking targets. The room stayed silent except for the hum of the projector. The judge's eyebrows climbed higher with every clip. Then the auditors were called. They testified plainly. Misuse of funds, falsified documentation, suspicious grant patterns from previous years. One of them even mentioned the attempt by an unidentified party to access the inquiry details. Everyone in the room knew who that was. Marissa's lawyer tried a desperate pivot, claiming she'd relied on bad information and that my garden posed ecological concerns. But the judge stopped him cold. "I see no evidence of environmental risk," he said. "Only evidence of unauthorized destruction," Marissa finally snapped. She stood up, shouting that I was sabotaging her career, that the county needed leadership, that I was a selfish recluse hoarding land. Her voice cracked on the last word. Phones lifted in the gallery. People recorded. The judge slammed his gavel. When the verdict came, it landed like a shovel hitting stone. Marissa was ordered to compensate me $56,000, stripped of her advisory privileges, and referred to the district attorney for possible criminal charges. She sank into her chair, trembling, as if the world had suddenly stopped revolving around her. I walked out without looking back. The courthouse doors opened, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt light. In the weeks after the verdict, my land felt strangely quiet, like the soil itself was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. The plaques Marissa had installed were removed by county workers. One of them apologized so sincerely, I almost felt bad for him. Almost. I used part of the compensation to bring in a specialized restoration crew from Sonoma, people who actually respected plants and didn't treat rare species like decorative mulch. Together, we rebuilt irrigation lines, revived compacted soil, and replanted the beds Marissa's crew had butchered. When the new Korean dogwood saplings arrived, carefully wrapped, rooted, and ready, I felt a knot loosen in my chest for the first time since the conference in Seattle. Students from UC Davis started visiting too, helping with soil tests, documenting regrowth patterns, sketching future research plots. It felt good watching them walk the garden paths with notebooks instead of shovels. One of the professors suggested formalizing the place as a micro-research site. I agreed immediately. If Marissa wanted a community improvement, well, she finally got one. Just not for her resume. As the garden recovered, news about Marissa spread through the county like spilled fertilizer. The audit expanded. Several of her old projects were flagged. The Development Advisory Board quietly removed her name from their website. Her mansion went up for sale, though from what I heard, buyers were wary. Apparently no one wanted the karma that came attached to her kitchen backsplash. One evening, just past sunset, I walked the property line on the western edge, her former domain of self-appointed influence. Her house looked dark, windows empty, driveway silent. No SUVs watching me, no workers sneaking around, no Lexus carving fresh wounds in my soil. Just stillness. I paused where the dogwoods had once stood, now marked by young, hopeful saplings reaching toward the fading sky. The air smelled clean, sharp with the scent of restoration. I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph, not vengeance. More like alignment. The land was mine again, in every sense that mattered. When I turned back toward the house, the motion lights flicked on, illuminating the newfound order of my rebuilt garden. Rows straightened, beds restored, a space reclaimed. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been planted, watered, and given room to grow.